The letter came at dusk, folded twice, sealed with a smear of wax the color of old blood, and it was set upon the mantel of the small parlor at Renmere, as if it had always meant to arrive there, and had only been delayed by weather. No one had signed the outside. No hand had been written upon it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, who had carried it in from the boy at the gate, laid it beside the brass candlestick with the caution of a woman handling a thing she did not wish to own, and then, having done her duty by it, she went out again into the passage and closed the door behind her without turning her head. That letter would undo 3 lives before the season turned, and it would mend 2 others past their own imagining. And everything that came after in the parish of Ellenshaw began in the hour that its wax cooled upon the mantelpiece. But to understand what was written inside it, and why the writing of it was itself an act of mercy dressed as cruelty, you must first be brought into the small room where the letter lay, and shown the woman who had not yet seen it, and told the sort of quiet in which she was living before that quiet was broken. Her name was Honora Trench, and at that hour she was in the still room at the back of the house, wearing the brown wool she had turned twice already at the cuffs, weighing dried mint upon a set of scales that had belonged to her mother, and speaking to no one, for there was no one at Renmere to speak to except Mrs. Peel, and Mrs. Peel had been trained by long service to know when silence was the greater courtesy. She was 26. She had been 26 for 11 months, and would be 27 in the spring, and she had accepted the fact of her age with the same dry patience with which she accepted the fact of the crack in the still-room window, which she had stopped up with a wedge of folded linen and did not intend to mention to anyone. She was thin without being frail. Her hands were red at the knuckles from cold water and from the honest usage of them. She wore her hair drawn plainly back, because plainness was the only ornament left to her that did not require money, and she had learnt, in the 4 years since her father's death, that money was a thing to be spoken of only in figures, and never in wishes. She had also, in that same season, learnt to weigh things. She weighed the mint now with the quiet exactness of a person who had discovered that a household could be saved or lost by the difference of a 1/4 ounce, and she took a small pride, which she would not have admitted to anyone living, in the neatness with which the tin scoop touched the pan. It is the way with women who have been cut down from a larger life to a smaller one. They find, or they invent, a set of small rigors to stand in for the larger dignities they have lost, and they perform these rigors in private, and the performance of them keeps them upright. Honora Trench had a great many such small rigors. She kept the accounts of Renmere in a green ledger that she balanced every Saturday evening. She darned her stockings on the 2nd and 4th Sundays of the month. She read 1 page of her father's old copy of the moral essays each morning before the fire was lit, and she believed, upon that particular evening, that the Duke of Ashendon meant to marry her before Michaelmas, and that this was a settled thing, and that in believing it she was not being foolish, but only patient, as a good woman ought to be. She was wrong in every particular of that belief, and she had been wrong in it for above a 12-month, though she had never once questioned it, and no one at Renmere had had the courage or the cruelty to correct her. That was the false hope she had never questioned, and the letter upon the mantel had been sent by a hand that had at last determined it must be broken. But even the hand that sent it did not yet know that a second letter, sent the same afternoon by another writer, was already upon the road to Renmere from a different quarter altogether, and that the 2 would arrive together, and that the meeting of the 2 upon the same mantelpiece would set in motion an accounting that had been waiting 18 years to be paid. A thing that has been waiting 18 years does not hurry. When at last it comes, it walks in at its own pace, and takes its seat, and expects to be given tea. The story of how Honora Trench had come to believe the Duke of Ashendon meant to marry her, and how she had come to live at Renmere alone with Mrs. Peel, must be told briefly, for it is only the wound of the story and not the story itself, and the story itself has scarcely begun. Renmere had once been a solid, unpretending house of 9 rooms, set in 6 acres of good pasture, with a spring at the bottom of the orchard that never froze, and it had belonged to Honora's father, who had been a decent, unlucky man. He had been decent in that he paid his laborers on the day the wages were due, and asked no more of his tenants than the ground would give. He had been unlucky in that he had trusted for a great many years a steward named Elias Corbin, who had come to the house at the age of 19, with a soft voice, a neat coat, and letters of character from a rector who had not troubled to read them closely, and who had by degrees, in a manner too small to be caught in any single year but too steady to be doubted across many, drawn off the estate's small profits into a set of ledgers of his own devising, and had done so with a face that did not quite match his words, and with a habit of laying his palm flat upon a page when a figure was queried, as though to press the figure into truth. Honora, who had been a child during most of these years, had loved Elias Corbin as a second uncle. Her father had died in the 3rd winter of her mourning for her mother, and the discovery of what Corbin had done, or the beginning of the discovery, had come only afterwards, and had come slowly, and had never yet come to its full accounting, for Corbin had drawn a soft veil of accident and misfortune over every question, and had wept once, becomingly in the parlor, and had continued as steward on reduced wages, because Honora had not had the strength in that first year to send him away and to keep the roof at the same time. He was steward still. He came up from the village every second morning. He laid his palm upon her ledger when she queried a figure, and he called her Miss Honora in a voice like warm milk, and the roof of Renmere leaked at the north corner, and the 6 acres had shrunk by 3 sails in 3 winters to a bare 2.5. This was the wound of Honora's life, and she carried it without complaint, and she believed she had it in hand, and she was wrong about that too, though less wrong than she was about the Duke. The Duke of Ashendon had ridden through the pasture on a September afternoon in the last year of her father's life, a young man then of 28, tall and easy in the saddle, with a laugh that made the laborers look up from their work and smile, without knowing why. He had drawn rein at the gate because Honora had been sitting upon it with a book, and he had asked her, in the manner of a well-bred stranger, whether the lane went through to Ellensford, and she had answered him gravely, without moving from the gate, that it did not, and had turned the page of her book, and he had laughed at that as though she had said a clever thing, and had dismounted, and had stayed an hour, and had come back the following week, and the week after that. There is no need to tell the middle of that acquaintance in any detail. It was neither strange nor original, and the Duke of Ashendon had ridden into the pasture of a great many young women in a great many counties, and had laughed at their sober answers, and had gone away again. What was strange was only this: he had ridden into Honora's pasture for 11 months together, and had spoken, on the last of those visits, of a spring wedding, and had ridden away that same evening upon a matter of business at his London house, and had never come back, and had never written, and had never sent word by any messenger. And Honora Trench, who was in every other quarter of her life the most clear-eyed of women, had chosen to believe, because to disbelieve would have been to acknowledge a fresh and unbearable ruin upon the ruin she already carried, that he had been detained by business, and would come, and had meant every word he had said. She had believed it through the winter. She had believed it through the following spring. She had believed it, in a quieter and more furniture-like way, through the summer that followed, and now the autumn was upon her again, and the letter she had not yet read was upon the mantel in the parlor, and it had been sent, not by the Duke of Ashendon, but by his younger brother, whom she had never met, and whom she had heard named only once, and then unfavorably as a cold. Correct man who kept the family's accounts and did not smile. His name was Lord Adrian Valley, and he had at that hour been 3 days upon the road from London, having come first by postchaise as far as Ellensford, and then by hired horse the last 8 miles to Ellenshaw, and he had taken a room at the Blue Hart in the village under his own name, because he had never in his life travelled under any other, and he had written the letter that afternoon at the inn's small desk, in a hand so exact that the innkeeper's wife, glancing over his shoulder as she set down the tray, had thought it copperplate and had said so. He had not smiled at the compliment. He had folded the letter, sealed it, given it into the hand of the boy at the gate, with a 6pence and directions to Renmere, and had then sat down at the desk again and written a second letter, not to Miss Trench but to his steward in London, upon a matter of a mortgage. And this second letter he had sealed with the same wax, and set beside the first tray of his supper, and had eaten his supper without tasting it, and had gone to bed. He was 35. He had not laughed in company for 9 years. He carried, in the inside pocket of his coat, a small folded miniature of a woman who had been dead 8 winters, and he did not look at it, but he knew, at any hour of the day, the exact place upon his person that the miniature occupied, as a man with an old wound knows where the ache lives. He had come to Ellenshaw upon what he had told himself was a plain errand of family duty, to inform Miss Honora Trench of Renmere, in language that could not be misunderstood, that his brother, the Duke of Ashendon, had been married in London a month since to Miss Lucinda Marbury of Portland Place, and that any expectation to the contrary was without foundation. He had told himself, upon setting out from London, that he was undertaking this errand because his brother would not, and because a wrong left unspoken hardened into a lie. He had told himself so at every posting-house between London and Ellensford. He would learn, before the week was out, that he had not been telling himself the truth, and he would learn it in a small parlour at Renmere, in the presence of a woman he had not yet seen, who was at that hour weighing mint in her still room, and had not yet been told that her life for a 12-month had been built upon a supposition, and everything that Lord Adrian Vale thought he was going to do would be undone by the sound of her voice speaking a single sentence he had not expected to hear. She came into the parlour at 7, having washed her hands and changed her apron for a clean one, and she saw the letter upon the mantel, and she did not, at first, touch it. She stood before the small fire and warmed her hands, and she looked at the letter with the same considering gaze with which she looked at a figure in the ledger that did not agree with the figure beside it. And she asked Mrs. Peel, who had come in with the tray, who had brought it. "A boy from the Blue Hart, Mrs." Peel said, "not one of ours." And Mrs. Peel, who loved her, and who had watched her carry the false hope of the Duke for a 12-month, with the mute pity of a servant who cannot cross the line of address, set down the tray, and went out and shut the door, for she had guessed, from the wax and from the boy and from the hour, what the letter contained, and she did not wish to be present when it was read. Honora broke the seal. She read the letter through once, standing. She read it a second time, seated. She read it a third time, and set it down upon her knee, and folded her hands upon the top of it, and looked into the fire for what Mrs. Peel afterwards said, upon being questioned, must have been near a quarter of an hour, though Mrs. Peel had not been in the room, and could only judge by the length of the silence beyond the door. The letter had been perfectly composed. It had said, in 3 short paragraphs, that the writer regretted the necessity of the intelligence he was about to convey, that his brother, the Duke of Ashendon, had, upon the 14th of the previous month, at St. George's in Hanover Square, been united in marriage to Miss Lucinda Marbury, that any understanding to the contrary of whatever antiquity was to be considered as having been at an end from a date preceding the said marriage, and that the writer held himself at Miss Trench's disposal at the Blue Hart in Ellenshaw for such interview as she might, at her convenience, require upon any matter arising. It had been signed Adrian Vale. It had contained no expression of sympathy and no formula of leave-taking beyond the necessary one. It had been, in short, the plainest instrument of demolition that a well-bred hand could draw. Honora had recognized, in reading it, that its author had spared her nothing, and had also spared her nothing that a decent woman had a right to be spared, and that these two propositions did not contradict one another, and she had, upon that recognition, given a single, quiet, dry sob into the fire, which was not weeping, but which was the small, compressed cost of a 12-month's belief being paid at once, and had then set the letter upon the mantel again beneath the brass candlestick, and had rung the bell for Mrs. Peel, and had asked, in a voice which Mrs. Peel afterwards described as steadier than her own, for a fresh pot of tea, for she said she should be sitting up late. She did not weep in Mrs. Peel's presence, and she did not weep after Mrs. Peel had gone. She sat before the fire until the fire went low, and then she banked it with the small iron bar with the same care she brought to every task in her house, and she took a candle up to her bedroom, and she lay down in her clothes upon the coverlet, because she had discovered, in the course of the evening, that she did not have the strength to undress, and she said aloud, to the low ceiling of the room in which she had slept every night since she was a child, one sentence, which was neither prayer nor complaint, but only a piece of plain arithmetic. I have been a fool for a 12-month, and I will not be a fool for a day longer. And there it is. You may answer me or not. She would answer herself the next morning by walking the 8 miles into Ellenshaw and requesting an interview with Lord Adrian Vale at the Blue Hart, and she would answer him in a voice as level as the writing of his letter, and she would speak in that interview a sentence he had not expected to hear, and the sentence would open a door in him that had been closed for 9 years and would not close again. But the interview at the Blue Hart, and what came of it, and the bargain that was struck between them at the end of it, and the 18-year reckoning that came riding up the lane behind them all like a slow bailiff, must wait upon their proper hour. It is enough for the present to know that the letter had been delivered, and had been read, and had been set beneath the brass candlestick, and that a woman at Renmere had put out her candle and had lain down in her clothes, and that a man at the Blue Hart, 8 miles off, had at that same hour woken from a shallow sleep with the taste of iron in his mouth, and had lain looking at the low beam of his ceiling, and had thought, without knowing why he thought it, that he had done a necessary thing badly. What neither of them knew, and what only the wise elder of this history knew, was that they had been brought within reach of one another by a hand not their own, and that the hand had been at work for above a year, and that the hand belonged to a woman older than either of them, who was at that hour 80 miles away, drinking a small glass of ratafia in her drawing-room at Marchvale and smiling, with the calm, settled satisfaction of a person whose plan is walking upon 2 separate roads exactly to its appointment. We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. Some griefs are audited overnight, and some are audited across a lifetime, and there is a difference between the two that only the survivors can tell you. Honora Trench rose at 5. As she rose every morning, she washed in cold water. As she washed every morning, she drank a cup of weak tea standing at the still-room window, as she drank every morning. And then, having done all this in the manner of a person who had not been altered by any event whatsoever, she put on her second-best bonnet and her one good cloak, and walked the 8 miles into Ellenshaw upon a road that was rutted at the 3rd mile and muddy at the 6th, and she arrived at the Blue Hart at 9:15, with the hem of her cloak spattered to the knee and her color high from the cold, and she asked, at the door of the tap, for Lord Adrian Vale, and gave her name as Miss Trench of Renmere. The innkeeper's wife, who had been polishing a tankard, set the tankard down with the deliberateness of a woman who has just understood a piece of local history in one breath, and went upstairs herself to carry the message, for she would not send the boy. Lord Adrian came down within the quarter hour, dressed as he had been at supper, having shaved. He offered Miss Trench the use of the parlor behind the tap, which was empty at that hour. He closed the door. He remained standing until she had seated herself. He said in a voice that had not been calibrated for the occasion because he had not permitted himself, on the road down or during the night, to imagine the occasion, that he had not looked to see her so soon, and that he was at her service. And Honora Trench, who had rehearsed no sentence in the walking of the 8 miles, because she had discovered by the 2nd mile that no rehearsed sentence would hold up in the room, looked at him across the small deal table with the same considering gaze she gave a doubtful figure in the ledger, and said what she had come to say. She said, "I thank you, my lord, for the plainness of your letter." She said, "You have spared me the labor of guessing, and that is the greatest kindness a stranger has done me in a 12-month. She said, "I do not ask you to answer for your brother. I do not think even you can." She said, "I ask only one thing, and I ask it because I have not the means to pursue it myself, and because it has waited too long already, and if you will do it, I shall consider that any debt you may feel yourself to owe me, upon your brother's behalf or upon your own, has been paid in full, and I shall trouble you no further." He waited. She named it. She said that her father's steward, one Elias Corbin, had for above 10 years drawn small sums from the estate of Renmere by devices too soft to be caught in any single year, and that she had known this for 4 years and had not had the strength to send him away, and that she wished someone with a colder head than her own to examine the books with her and to tell her what had been taken, and to help her put the man out of her house. She said, "I do not ask this of you because you are a gentleman. I ask it because you are a stranger, and I have no one else." And having said that, she folded her hands in her lap upon the damp hem of her cloak, and waited. Lord Adrian Vale did not answer at once. He had come to Ellenshaw prepared for tears, for accusation, for a scene, for a fainting, for the whole apparatus of a wronged woman's grief, and he had come prepared to be equal to any of these with the correct formality of a man who had discharged an unpleasant duty, and he had not come prepared for a woman who, upon receiving the demolition of her hope, would rise the next morning and walk 8 miles in the rain to ask a stranger to help her audit her steward. He looked at her hands, which were red at the knuckles. He looked at the hem of her cloak. He looked at her face, which was quite steady, and he saw in it, for one clean, uncomfortable instant, the shape of the woman his own dead wife would have been at 26 had she been given the years, and he set the thought down at once as a thing not to be picked up again. He said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that he was at her service in the matter, and that he would come to Renmere the following morning, if that was convenient, and would remain in the country for such time as the audit required. And Honora, who had not looked for so complete a yes, inclined her head, and said only that she was obliged to him, and rose to go, and he said, before she reached the door, and in a tone that surprised him as he heard it leave his own mouth, that he would send a chaise for her at noon, for the road was not fit for walking, and she must not walk it back. She looked at him across the small parlor, and she said, "I thank you, my lord. But I walked it once this morning, and I shall walk it once this evening, for I have not yet learned how to accept a kindness without adding it to a ledger, and I do not wish to owe you anything I cannot pay." And she went out. He stood at the parlor window and watched her cross the yard of the Blue Hart with her cloak drawn about her, and he did not know that he had begun, in that quarter hour, to move for the first time in 9 years, and that the movement had been so small that he had mistaken it for the ordinary shifting of a man in a chair. He came to Renmere the following morning, as he had said he would, and he came the morning after that, and the morning after that, and Elias Corbin, who was in the small office off the passage when the second morning's carriage was heard upon the gravel, laid his palm flat upon the open ledger as was his custom, and did not lift it again for some seconds, for he had known from the moment Mrs. Peel mentioned a gentleman from London that the soft years were ending, and he had begun in that instant the small, procedural, cowardly calculations of a man arranging his retreat. Lord Adrian did not sit with him the first day. Lord Adrian sat with Miss Trench in the parlor, at her father's old desk, with the green ledger open between them, and asked her, in the quiet voice of a man who had audited larger accounts than these, and would not permit himself to condescend to a smaller one, to tell him what she believed, and then to tell him what she could prove, and to keep the two lists separate, and Honora, who had never in her life been asked by any other person to separate what she believed from what she could prove, felt something inside her, which had for 4 years been folded very tightly, begin, by the smallest possible degree, to loosen. He did not touch her hand. He did not offer her sympathy. He read the figures with her, and where a figure did not agree with a figure beside it, he made a small mark in pencil in the margin, and when Corbin was called in upon the second afternoon and asked to account for the small marks, Corbin's palm went again to the page, and Lord Adrian said, in the same flat voice he had used at the Blue Hart, "Take your hand off the ledger, Mr. Corbin. I cannot see the figure beneath it." And Corbin took his hand off the ledger and did not put it back. It was upon the third evening of this labor, when the light had gone from the parlor window and Mrs. Peel had brought in candles and had gone out again, that Honora Trench said the sentence which Lord Adrian Vale had not expected to hear, and which he would remember, afterwards, as the true beginning of everything that changed him. She had been reading aloud from a column of small sums, and she had paused, and she had set down her pencil, and she had said, "Without looking up, my lord, I ought to tell you that I do not blame your brother." She said, "I blame myself for having believed a thing that was easier to believe than to examine, and I blame the world a little for making it so hard for a woman in my position to examine any belief that promised her a roof." She said, "But your brother I do not blame, for he was young, and he was kind in his way, and he did not, I think, ever mean to be cruel. He only meant to be pleased, and when the pleasure ended, he did what such men do, which is to look away." She said, "You have come here in his place, and you have done in 3 days what he ought to have done in 3 lines a 12-month ago, and I have thought about that a great deal since yesterday evening." And she said, at last, without lifting her eyes from the ledger, "You are a better man than your brother, my lord, and I say it not as a compliment, but as a fact, and I say it once. And I shall not say it again, for it is not the sort of thing that should be said twice." And she picked up her pencil and went on with the column of small sums. Lord Adrian Vale did not answer her. He sat very still, and he looked at the candle upon the desk, and he found that he could not, for some seconds, remember what figure they had been reading before she spoke. And he was obliged to ask her, in a voice that was almost even, to begin the column again, and she began the column again without any remark, as though she had said nothing out of the common way. And they finished the column and closed the ledger, and he went out to his hired horse at the door, and he rode back to the Blue Hart through a cold, clear moonlight. And he did not, that night, sit down at the small desk in his room to write to his steward in London upon the matter of the mortgage, though he had intended to. He sat instead upon the edge of the bed with his gloves still on, and he took from the inside pocket of his coat the small folded miniature that had lived there for 9 winters, and he opened it, and he looked at it, and he closed it again. And he set it upon the table beside the bed, which was the first time in 9 years that it had spent a night out of his coat, and he went to sleep without undressing further, as she had done 3 nights before, and neither of them knew that they had lain down in their clothes upon the same account. The audit at Renmere took 11 days, and at the end of it Elias Corbin was put out of the house without a scene and without a summons, upon terms that Lord Adrian had drawn up in one sitting at the little desk in the parlor, and had read aloud once, slowly, so that the man might understand. Corbin was to sign a paper acknowledging in figures the sum he had drawn off. He was to leave the parish within the week. He was to make no further application to Miss Trench, in person or by letter, upon any pretext, and in return, and only in return, no information would be laid before the magistrate, and no notice would be given in the county, and he was to be allowed to depart with the character of a man who had grown too old for his post, which was the mercy of the arrangement, and was more mercy than he deserved, and was granted him upon Miss Trench's express desire, and not upon Lord Adrian's, for Lord Adrian would have laid the information and had said so. Corbin signed. He wept once, becomingly, in the passage, and Mrs. Peel, who was passing, did not look at him. He went out of the door of Renmere at 4 in the afternoon of a Thursday in October, with a small valise, and he did not look back, for he had been told not to, and even in his cowardice he retained enough of the discipline of a servant to obey a plain instruction, and he walked down the drive, and he turned into the lane, and he was not seen at Renmere again. And the north corner of the roof was mended before the first hard frost, out of the sum he had signed for, though he had not lived to pay a shilling of it, for he died at Bristol the following spring of a chill taken upon the road, and was buried by strangers, and was mourned by no one, and this is all that need be said of him. For a man who has spent his life in the small procedural betrayals of a soft voice and a flat palm is a man whom the story is entitled to dispatch in 1 paragraph and to leave. But the 11 days of the audit had done other work than the closing of the ledger. They had brought Lord Adrian Vale to Renmere every morning at 10, and had kept him there until the light went from the parlor window, and had accustomed Mrs. Peel to laying an extra plate at the middle meal without being asked, and had accustomed Honora to the sound of a second pen scratching in the parlor beside her own, and had accustomed Lord Adrian to the sight of a red-knuckled hand turning the page of a green ledger with the neatness of a woman who had made neatness her one remaining ornament. And these are not the sorts of accustomings that come undone when the ledger is closed. Upon the last evening he did not ride at once to the Blue Hart. He stood in the parlor with his gloves in his hand, and he looked at the fire, and he said, without turning, that he had at his own house in Northshire a small estate, no larger than Renmere had once been, which had for some years been managed at a distance and would benefit from a resident hand, and that if she would consider, upon terms he would set down in writing, and she should be free to amend, taking charge of the accounts of that estate at a proper salary, he would consider himself a fortunate man in the arrangement, and that he made the offer to her as one man of business to another, and upon no other footing, and she was to understand that the acceptance or refusal of it would in no degree alter his willingness to serve her in any matter now or hereafter arising. He did not look at her while he said this. He looked at the fire. Honora Trench sat at the desk, with her hands folded upon the closed ledger, and she looked at the back of his coat. And she considered the offer as she would have considered a figure in a column, and she saw that it was a decent figure, and an honest one, and she saw also, with the clarity of a woman who had had 1 year's foolishness burnt out of her in one evening, and would not be foolish again, that the offer had cost the man who made it something to make, and that he did not know himself yet what it had cost him, and would not know for some weeks, and that this was not her business to tell him. She said, at length, that she was obliged to him for the offer, and that she would consider it, and that she would give him her answer within the fortnight, and she said also, in the same level voice, that if she accepted, it should be upon the express understanding that no expectation of any other sort attached to the arrangement, and that she should be free to leave the post upon a month's notice should any such expectation appear to arise, and that she said this not because she distrusted him, but because she distrusted, upon the evidence of her own life, her own capacity to interpret a gentleman's silences. And he inclined his head to the fire, and said that the understanding was accepted, and that he would put it in the paper himself, and that she should not have the writing of it. And he took up his gloves, and bowed to her, and went out, and rode to the Blue Hart, and left for London the following morning at 7, and did not come again to Renmere for 41 days. In those 41 days the season turned. The first hard frost came upon the 2nd of November, and stripped the orchard clean, and Honora walked in the orchard upon the morning after the frost, and picked up one late apple from the ground, and turned it in her hand, and put it in her apron, and thought, without permitting herself to dwell upon the thought, that she had accepted the offer in her own mind before she had accepted it upon paper, and that she would send her answer at the end of the fortnight, and that she would go into Northshire before Christmas. She did send the answer. She did go. She travelled in a hired chaise which he sent for her, at his expense and against her stated preference, upon the argument that the roads in November were not fit for the mail, and she arrived at the small house in Northshire, which was called Ledgerhope by the local people out of a joke made 3 generations back that no one remembered the meaning of, upon a Wednesday afternoon in a light snow, and she was met at the door by an elderly woman in a black gown, who introduced herself as Mrs. Ivory the housekeeper, and who conducted her at once to the small parlor and the small bedroom that had been prepared for the new steward, and who did not, at any point in the conducting, address her as anything other than Miss Trench, which was, Honora understood, a courtesy that had been arranged in advance, and had been arranged with care, and she understood also, upon seeing the small parlor and the small bedroom, that Lord Adrian Vale was not at Ledgerhope, and had left instructions that she was not to be troubled by his presence for the first fortnight, that she might settle to the work without embarrassment, and she understood, standing at the window of the small parlor and looking out upon the snow, that she had been treated, for the first time in a 12-month, as a person whose dignity was another person's active care, and she sat down in the chair by the fire, and she wept, for 4 minutes into a folded handkerchief, and then she stopped weeping, and she washed her face at the basin, and she went down to the study to look at the accounts, for she was, after all, the steward. And the steward's business was not tears. And so began the slow accretion of a labor and a household that neither of them would have named as anything but a professional arrangement for many months together, and yet it advanced, day by day, as such things advanced when they are made of the right materials, through the small proof acts of character that no declaration can substitute for. He came at last to Ledgerhope upon the 16th day, and he asked her, at their first meeting in the study, whether she found the accounts in order, and she said that she found them in the order of a man who had trusted his London people too far, and his Northshire people too little. And he received the criticism without expression and asked her to remedy it as she saw fit. And left her to it. She remedied it. She rode out with the bailiff twice a week upon a quiet old mare that had been assigned to her without ceremony, and she came back with mud to the hem of her habit, and she wrote up her notes at the study desk in the evening, and he sat, in those evenings, in the chair by the fire on the other side of the room, reading the London papers, and neither of them spoke for hours together, and the silence between them was of the sort that in a house without such a silence would have been felt as strain, and in that house was felt as a kind of shared roof. She learnt in those weeks that he rose at 5 as she did, and drank his tea standing as she did, and read 1 page of a moral essayist every morning as she did, though not the same essayist, and he learnt in those weeks that she carried the small iron bar to bank the fire herself at night rather than trouble the housemaid, and that she mended her own stockings on Sunday evenings, and that she counted the eggs from the yard against the eggs in the kitchen every Saturday, and that she did all this not from suspicion, but from the habit of a woman who had once lost a household by inattention and would not lose another. And he found, upon making these small observations, that he had begun to look for her at breakfast, and at the middle meal, and at the reading of the papers, and to feel, if she was late by 5 minutes into the study of a morning, a small unaccountable tightening at the top of his chest, which he did not permit himself to name, and which named itself, in its own time, without his permission. It named itself upon a February afternoon in the study at Ledgerhope, when Honora, bending to lift a heavy quarterly ledger down from the high shelf, dropped the book upon her own foot and did not cry out, and set the book upon the desk and sat down and said nothing, and he, coming in a moment later, saw her sitting very upright at the desk with her face gone rather white, and asked her what was the matter, and she said, quite steadily, that she had dropped a book upon her foot. And would he be so good as to ring for Mrs. Ivory? He rang. He did not sit down. He stood at the window with his back to her and looked out into the walled garden, and Mrs. Ivory came and took Honora upstairs, and it was found that the foot was bruised but not broken, and Honora was ordered to keep to her room until the following morning, and Lord Adrian Vale stood in the study alone for above an hour after she had been taken up. And he said aloud into the empty room, in a voice he did not recognize, the sentence, "She might have broken her foot in this house and never made a sound, and I should not have known." And he sat down at the desk, and he put his face in his hands, for the space of one dry sob, which was not weeping, but which was the small compressed cost of 9 years' silence being paid at once. And he then took out his handkerchief, and folded it, and put it back, and rang the bell, and asked Mrs. Ivory upon her return whether Miss Trench was comfortable, and was told that she was, and he went out to the stable, and rode alone for 2 hours in the cold, and came back at dusk, and did not go up to her, and after supper, which he took alone, he wrote her a note upon a half sheet of paper, which said only, "I hope you are recovered, and if there is any assistance I can render you, may command me." He did not sign it. He sealed it. He gave it to Mrs. Ivory. He went to bed. And Honora, sitting up in bed at Ledgerhope with her foot upon a folded shawl, read the note twice, and folded it, and set it inside the front cover of the green ledger she had brought with her from Renmere, where it lay against the first entry her father had made in his own hand 30 years before, and she said aloud into the empty room, in a voice she did not recognize, the sentence, "He will not know that he has done it, and I shall not tell him," and she blew out the candle, and lay down, and slept. This was the beginning of the near gesture that they were both to become expert in that spring, the note not signed, the door held open half a beat longer than necessary, the chair drawn a fraction closer to the desk, the offer of the second cup of tea, the walk in the garden at the hour he was known to be at his correspondence, the enquiry after her foot 2 days after she had ceased to limp. Neither of them named these small motions, neither of them permitted themselves to name them. And neither of them noticed, though Mrs. Ivory and the bailiff and the coachman and the boy at the gate all noticed that in the space of 6 weeks from the dropping of the book, Lord Adrian Vale had ceased to keep the miniature of his dead wife in the inside pocket of his coat, and had begun to keep it in the drawer of his writing table, and that this was the first shifting of a weight he had carried for 9 years, and that he had shifted it without knowing that he had, and that no one in the house would ever tell him. It was in this spring also that the news came from London. The news came in a letter from Lord Adrian's London steward, and it was read at breakfast, and it said, with the correct compression of such letters, that the Duke of Ashendon had died upon the previous Sunday of an inflammation of the lungs, that the funeral had taken place at the family seat at Ashendon Court upon the Wednesday following, that his widow the Duchess was in strict retirement at Portland Place, and that certain matters of the estate awaited Lord Adrian's attention in London at his earliest convenience, upon which subject he, the steward, would say no more in a letter. Lord Adrian read the letter through once. He folded it. He set it beside his plate. He said to Honora across the breakfast table, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that his brother was dead, and that he must go up to London within the week. She set down her cup. She said, "I am sorry, my lord." She said it plainly, and without any adornment, and she meant it plainly and without any adornment, and he looked at her across the toast rack and saw that she meant it, and that the meaning of it was not the meaning that would once have been in the room, and he said, "I know you are, and thank you." And they finished their breakfast in silence, and he went up to London that same afternoon, and was gone 31 days. In those 31 days a great deal happened at Portland Place and at Ashendon Court, which need not be told in detail, for it is the outer machinery of the story and not its inner life. But 2 things must be told, for they bear directly upon what came after. The first was that the Duke of Ashendon, upon his deathbed, had made a codicil to his will in the presence of his physician and his valet, in which he had directed that the sum of £6,000 be paid out of his personal estate to Miss Honora Trench of Renmere, in the county of Ellenshaw, in acknowledgement, as the codicil put it, of an obligation of honor not otherwise dischargeable. And the second was that the widow, the new Duchess of Ashendon, upon reading the codicil in the presence of her lawyer and her brother-in-law, had at first turned red, and then white, and had then said in a very level voice that she should not contest the codicil, and had signed the paper acknowledging it, and had then risen and gone to the window and said, without turning, "I did not know there had been a Miss Trench," and Lord Adrian, who had been present at the reading in his capacity as executor, had said only, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that there had been. She was in every other quarter a beautiful entitled woman, the new Duchess of Ashendon, and she had married the late Duke in the full knowledge that she was the choice of his mother rather than of his heart, and she had believed, in the manner of women brought up as she had been brought up, that the choice of a mother was a more durable article than the choice of a heart. And she had had 11 months in which to discover that this was not, in her case, quite true, and that her husband had been kind to her in the way that a man is kind to a horse he did not choose, and that she had, in consequence, learnt to fight with the smiling, well-mannered, unraised voice cruelty that women in her position learn to fight with, and had turned that cruelty first upon her husband and then, after his death, and upon the reading of the codicil, upon the person of Miss Honora Trench of Renmere, whom she had never met, and whom she now determined, upon 3 days' reflection and 1 long conversation with a cousin who ought to have known better, to visit at Ledgerhope in Northshire, under a colour of condolence, and to see for herself. She wrote to Lord Adrian at his London house, in a hand as neat as his own, requesting the direction of his Northshire property, saying that she wished to write a private letter to Miss Trench upon the subject of the codicil, and Lord Adrian, who did not distrust her because he had not yet learned to, gave her the direction, and she did not write. She travelled. She arrived at Ledgerhope upon a fine morning in April, in her own carriage, wearing half mourning, and Mrs. Ivory, who opened the door to her, went white at the sight of the carriage panel and stood aside, and the Duchess of Ashendon was shown into the small parlour, where Honora Trench had 4 months earlier wept for 4 minutes into a folded handkerchief, and Honora came down from the study. In her plain dark gown, with a pencil still behind her ear from the morning's work, and found her seated by the fire. The interview that took place in that parlour lasted 3/4 of an hour by the clock upon the mantel, and it was conducted, upon both sides, without a raised voice, and when the Duchess of Ashendon left the room at the end of it, she was pale about the mouth, and Honora Trench was standing at the window with her back to the room, and neither of them ever, in after years, gave any account of what had been said between them, though Mrs. Ivory, who had listened at the door for the first 10 minutes out of a sense of duty and not of curiosity, was able to report that the Duchess had begun by offering, in a voice of restrained sweetness, to double the codicil sum out of her own portion in return for a written undertaking that Miss Trench would remove herself from Ledgerhope within the week, and would form no further connection with Lord Adrian Vale of any description whatsoever, and that Honora had heard the offer through, and had then said, in a voice that Mrs. Ivory afterwards said was steadier than she had ever heard a woman's voice be in a quarrel, that she thanked her Grace for the offer, and that she would not accept it, and that she would not accept it not because the sum was insufficient, for the sum was more than sufficient, but because the transaction her Grace proposed was one that only a woman without dignity could accept, and that she, Honora, had after a 12 months' foolishness recovered her dignity at some expense, and did not propose to sell it now at any price, and that she would remain at Ledgerhope as steward for so long as Lord Adrian Vale required her services in that capacity, and no longer, and that as to any other connection between herself and his lordship there was none, and there had never been any. And there would be none unless it was proposed to her in a manner and upon terms that her Grace was not competent to alter, and that her Grace might report this speech to whomsoever she pleased, and might attach to it whatever construction she pleased, and that the interview, so far as Miss Trench was concerned, was at an end, and the Duchess of Ashendon had risen at that, and had said in the same restrained sweet voice that she saw she had been mistaken in Miss Trench, and had then, in the doorway, and out of Mrs. Ivory's line of sight, turned once and said one further sentence which Mrs. Ivory did not catch, and which Honora did not repeat, and had gone out, and had entered her carriage, and had driven away, and had never come to Ledgerhope again. What she had said, in the doorway, out of Mrs. Ivory's line of sight, was, "I did not know it was possible to be so poor and so proud together, and I am obliged to you for the instruction, Miss Trench, though I do not thank you for it." And she had gone. Honora had stood at the window until the carriage was gone from sight, and had then sat down in the chair by the fire, and had said aloud into the empty room, in a voice she did not recognize, the sentence, "I have been 3 times a fool in 1 12-month, but I will not be a 4th time," and she had gone up to the study, and she had opened the green ledger, and she had worked upon the quarterly figures until Mrs. Ivory came to call her to the middle meal, and she had not written to Lord Adrian in London upon the subject of the visit, for she had judged, upon reflection, that it was not her business to carry the tale, and that if the tale were to be carried, it should be carried by the woman who had come to tell it, and not by the woman who had been made to hear it. and so Lord Adrian in London did not learn of the visit at that time, and the Duchess of Ashendon, having reflected upon the interview during the whole of her drive back to town, and having reflected further upon it during the whole of the following week, and having consulted the cousin who ought to have known better, and having received from that cousin the wrong advice for the second time, wrote a letter, not to Honora, but to a lady of her acquaintance in Northshire, who was a great giver of dinners and a greater retailer of gossip, and in this letter she communicated, in a tone of pained sisterly concern, that Miss Trench of Ledgerhope, who was said to be steward to Lord Adrian Vale, was in fact a person of quite another character than the county supposed, and that she had it upon her own authority that Miss Trench had, before her installation at Ledgerhope, an understanding of a most particular kind with the late Duke of Ashendon, and that the codicil of £6,000 was to be understood in that light, and that she wrote in confidence and upon no account for repetition. And the lady of her acquaintance received this letter with the mingled horror and delight proper to such letters, and repeated its contents that same evening at dinner, upon no account for repetition, to 3 other ladies and 1 clergyman, and by the end of the following fortnight the story had passed through Northshire in the manner such stories pass, being sharpened at each remove, and had reached at last, in the middle of May, the ears of Lady Marchvale of Marchvale in Northshire, who was the wise elder of this history, and who was 80 miles closer to Ledgerhope than she had been at the drinking of the ratafia, and Lady Marchvale, upon hearing the story, set down her cup and said one word, which was nonsense, and then rose from her chair and ordered her carriage. Lady Marchvale was 71, and had been Lord Adrian Vale's godmother, and had been the friend of his mother, and had known Honora Trench's mother as a girl, and had been the hand that had for above a year been at work upon 2 separate roads to bring Adrian Vale and Honora Trench within reach of one another, for it had been Lady Marchvale who had written. In the spring of the previous year, the anonymous letter to Adrian in London informing him of the Duke's neglect at Renmere and pricking his family conscience to travel down, and it had been Lady Marchvale who had, upon Adrian's cold reply that he would go and give the plain information and no more, judged that the plain information delivered by such a man to such a woman would produce, if it produced anything, a match, and it had been Lady Marchvale who, upon hearing from Mrs. Ivory, who was her cousin, that the plain information had been delivered and the audit undertaken and the post at Ledgerhope offered and accepted, had smiled her calm settled smile, and drunk her ratafia and waited. She had not intended the death of the Duke of Ashendon. She had not intended the visit of the Duchess. She had not intended the letter to the Lady of Dinners. But she had intended, from the beginning, that Adrian Vale and Honora Trench should stand within the same room together, and she had judged that once they had so stood, the rest could be trusted to their own decency and her own vigilance, and she now perceived that her vigilance was required. And she set forth from Marchvale upon the 16th of May in her old-fashioned barouche, and arrived at Ledgerhope upon the 17th in the middle of the afternoon, and was shown into the small parlour by Mrs. Ivory, with a look between the 2 women that had 30 years of correspondence in it, and she sat down in the chair by the fire, and she rang the bell herself, and she said to Mrs. Ivory, when Mrs. Ivory returned, "Send Miss Trench to me, and do not tell her who I am until she has sat down." Honora came. She sat down. Lady Marchvale looked at her for a long half-minute in silence, and then said, in the blunt voice of a woman too old to be argued with, "My dear, I am Lady Marchvale of Marchvale, and I knew your mother, and I have known Adrian Vale since he was in short coats, and I have been meddling in both your lives for above a 12-month without your knowledge, and I have come to tell you that I intend to meddle for 1 week more, at the end of which I shall retire from the business and leave you to it, for I am 71, and I intend to die in my own bed, and not in someone else's parlor. And I require you now to tell me, without any of the reserve that has served you so well hitherto, whether you love Adrian Vale, for a story has been put about in this county which will require answering, and I will not undertake the answering of it upon a false footing. And Honora Trench, who had been steady in the parlor with the Duchess of Ashendon, and steady at the desk with the ledger, and steady upon 8 miles of muddy road, was not steady before Lady Marchvale, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not answer for above a minute, and at length she said, in a voice that was not quite level, I do not know, madam, whether what I feel is love, for I have believed myself to be in love once in my life, and have been mistaken, and I have vowed since then to trust nothing in myself that resembles that former feeling. But I know that I would rather sit at the same desk as Lord Adrian Vale for the rest of my life without speaking, than sit at any other desk with any other man and be spoken to every day, and if that is love, madame, then I am in it. And if it is not, then I do not know what other name to give it, and I have not the courage to give it a name that turns out again to be wrong. And Lady Marchvale, who had heard many declarations in her 71 years, and had learnt to distinguish the true from the pretty, nodded once, and said, in the same blunt voice, That will do, my dear, and I thank you, and now you may go and fetch me some tea, for I am tired from the road. And Honora rose and went out, and did not know that in the fetching of the tea she had already been married in Lady Marchvale's mind. The story that had been put about was answered, in the event, by Lady Marchvale in the space of 5 days, and it was answered by the simple device of Lady Marchvale, requiring Honora to come to Marchvale for a week upon a visit, and giving a dinner upon the 3rd evening, at which she seated Honora upon her own right hand, and named her, in the hearing of every giver of dinners in Northshire, as the daughter of her oldest friend, and as a young woman for whose character she would answer with her own. And it was answered further by Lord Adrian Vale, who arrived from London upon the 4th day of the visit upon a summons from his godmother, which he had not been permitted to refuse, and who was seated at that dinner upon Honora's other side, and who spoke to her, across the soup, and across the fish, and across the joint, of the accounts at Ledgerhope in the flat voice he kept for facts, and who thereby communicated in the only language that either of them had yet permitted themselves to speak in public, that the story was without foundation, and that he stood as her employer and her friend, and it was answered finally by the county itself, which is a slower judge than the drawing-rooms of London, but a fairer one, and which, upon considering the evidence of Lady Marchvale's right hand, and Lord Adrian's flat voice and Miss Trench's plain, dark gown, concluded within the fortnight that it had been imposed upon by a widow's grief, and forgave itself for the imposition without forgiving the widow, and the story died, as such stories die, not by contradiction, but by a general agreement to speak of other things. Upon the last evening of the visit at Marchvale, Lady Marchvale, who had judged that her meddling had reached the point at which any further meddling would be an insult, sent Honora down the long walled garden at 8 o'clock upon an errand about a cutting of rosemary, and sent Adrian, 5 minutes afterwards, down the same walk upon an errand about a book she had lent him, and now required back. And they met, as she had known they would, at the sundial at the far end of the walk, in the last light of a fine May evening, with the smell of turned earth in the air and one blackbird continuing its business in the hedge, and Lord Adrian Vale standing 3 paces from Honora Trench upon the gravel, with his hands behind his back and his eyes upon the sundial, said, without any preface, and in a voice that was not flat, I shall say this once, and say it badly, and I ask you to hear the whole of it. He said, I have loved you, I believe, from the evening you told me I was a better man than my brother, though I did not know it then, and I did not know it upon the day you dropped the book upon your foot, and I did not know it upon any of the days between. And I know it now, and I have known it, if I am honest with myself, since the morning I read at breakfast that my brother was dead, and you said you were sorry, and I saw that you meant it, and I have not spoken until now, because I have not been sure that I had the right to speak. Being 9 years the elder, and being the brother of the man who used you ill, and being your employer, and being a man who has kept a miniature in his coat pocket for 9 winters, and who does not yet know whether he has taken it out for good, or has only laid it down. But I have judged, upon reflection, that if I did not speak now, I should never speak, and that a man who does not speak when he ought to speak is a man who resembles my brother more nearly than I care to resemble him, and so I speak. And I ask you, not this evening, but at your own hour, whether you will consider me. There it is. You may answer me or not. And he did not look at her. And Honora Trench, who had rehearsed no sentence because she had not known she was to be asked one, and who had been asked one, looked at the back of his coat, and at the blackbird in the hedge, and at the sundial upon which the last light was falling, and she said, in a voice that was quite steady but not flat, "Adrian, I will consider you, and I have considered you, and my answer is yes, and I say it once, and I shall not say it again this evening, for it is not the sort of thing that should be said twice, and I say it as Honora and not as Miss Trench, and I ask you to hear the whole of it." And she stepped across the 3 paces of gravel, and she took his hand, which was cold, and she said his given name for the first time in the 7 months of their acquaintance, and the saying of the name was, in that garden, the opening of a door that had been closed for 9 years and would not close again, and Lord Adrian Vale, whose eyes were not dry, and who did not attempt to make them so, said only, in the voice that was not flat, "Honora," and did not attempt any further speech, and the blackbird went on with its business in the hedge, and Lady Marchvale, who had walked as far as the second bend of the walk under a pretext of her own, turned back at that point without going further, for she had heard, in the silence between the last 2 sentences, all that she required to hear. And she did not intend to be present at the rest, and she went into the house and sat down by her own fire and drank a small glass of ratafia, and did not smile, for the matter was too large for smiling, and had passed at last out of the province of meddling and into the province of blessing. They were married in the church at Marchvale upon a Thursday morning in the middle of June, at 9 o'clock, by the old rector who had known Lady Marchvale for 40 years, in the presence of Lady Marchvale and Mrs. Ivory and Mrs. Peel, who had come up from Renmery for the purpose in a black bonnet trimmed for the occasion, with a piece of white ribbon that she had unpicked from her mother's wedding gown 50 years before, and of the bailiff and the coachman and the boy at the gate, and of no one else, and the whole ceremony took 11 minutes, and afterwards there was a breakfast at Marchvale, and at that breakfast Lady Marchvale rose, and lifted her glass, and said, in her blunt voice, to Adrian and Honora, and to a marriage upon which I have spent above a 12-month of meddling, and shall not spend another quarter of an hour. For I am 71, and I intend to die in my own bed. And she drank, and sat down, and the bailiff, who had drunk more of his wine than he ought, said aloud to the boy at the gate, in a whisper the whole table heard, that he had known from the first morning he took her out upon the old mare that Miss Trench would be the mistress of Ledgerhope before the year was out, and that he would have laid a shilling upon it if he had had a shilling to spare. And the boy at the gate said gravely, in reply, that a shilling was a great deal of money. And the table laughed, and Honora laughed, and it was the first time Mrs. Ivory had ever heard her laugh aloud in company, and she said afterwards to Mrs. Peel, in the passage, "It is like hearing a bird one had not known lived in the house." and Adrian did not laugh, but he smiled once at the boy at the gate, and the smile was the near gesture completed. At last, that had begun in the study at Ledgerhope in February, and Honora saw it complete, and she inclined her head to the sundial in the garden across the room, though there was no sundial in that room, and only she and he knew what the inclination meant. The story of what came after may be told in the manner of an old accounting, item by item, without dwelling. Mrs. Peel returned to Renmere, which was now Honora's still, and lived out the remainder of her life there in the character of housekeeper and afterwards, at Honora's insistence, in the character of tenant, and died at the age of 82 in her own bed, with a piece of white ribbon from her mother's wedding gown pinned to her pillow. Having been visited by Honora upon each of her last 3 birthdays, and the house at Renmere passed, upon her death, into the hands of a young cousin of Honora's father, whom Honora had sought out and educated at her own expense, and who kept the 6 acres and did not let them shrink further. Elias Corbin, of whom enough has been said, died at Bristol and was buried by strangers. The Duchess of Ashendon retired into deeper mourning than was required of her, and lived for a further 24 years at Portland Place, and became, in her later life, a great giver of alms to unmarried women in reduced circumstances, and was not received by Lady Marchvale, and was received once by Honora, who paid her a call of civility upon the 10th anniversary of the late Duke's death, and drank 1 cup of tea and departed, and the 2 women parted without embracing, but also without asperity. And the Duchess said, at the door, in the same doorway voice she had used at Ledgerhope, "I do not thank you for it, Lady Vale, but I am obliged to you." And Honora inclined her head, and went out, and did not come again, and the Duchess died in her own bed at the age of 63, and left the whole of her private fortune to the founding of a house for the education of orphaned girls in the county of Ellenshaw, of which house Honora was for many years the principal patroness. Lady Marchvale did not die in her own bed the year of the wedding, but lived a further 11 years, and became godmother to the 2 children of the marriage, and gave the elder her own name and the younger the name of Adrian's mother, and did in the end die in her own bed at the age of 82, with Honora sitting on one side of her and Adrian upon the other, and her last words were to Adrian, and were, "You have done better than I planned, my dear," which is the highest praise a meddler can give. There were 2 children, as has been said. The elder, a girl, was Eleanor Marchvale Vale, and grew up at Ledgerhope, and was taught by her mother to keep an account book at the age of 9, and did not marry until she was 30, and married then a country physician of no particular fortune and of great steadiness, and was happy, and the younger, a boy, was Charles Adrian Vale, and inherited nothing but his mother's practical hands and his father's flat voice for facts, and went as a young man into the law, and made his own way, and neither child was pressed into any career or match, for their parents had learnt, between them, the cost of a life spent believing what was easier to believe than to examine, and did not intend that their children should pay that cost also. Adrian did, after some years, take the miniature of his first wife out of the drawer of his writing table, and gave it, upon a quiet evening, into Honora's hand, and Honora took it and looked at it, and gave it back to him, and said only that she should keep it in the drawer of her own writing table, if he would permit her, for it belonged to the household and not to any one member of it. And Adrian permitted her, and it lay there, and was not looked at often, and was not hidden either, and was in this manner honored without being enshrined, which was the arrangement, they both understood without saying, that a decent marriage owed to a first love that had not been dishonored by death. And Honora did in time cease to weigh the mint in the still room upon her mother's scales, though she kept the scales upon the shelf, and she did in time cease to darn her own stockings upon the 2nd and 4th Sundays of the month, though she kept the darning basket, and she never entirely ceased to bank the fire herself at night with the small iron bar, and Adrian did not ask her to. And yet, for all this, they knew, and honored what they knew, that some accounts are never settled, and that some doors, once shut, stay shut. The Duke of Ashendon, who had ridden into the pasture and had laughed at a grave answer, was dead at 33, and no marriage at Marchvale and no child at Ledgerhope brought him back. The 12-month Honora had spent in the belief that he would come was gone from her life, and though she had recovered from the belief, she had not recovered the 12-month, and she knew that she never would. Some years do not return. The 9 winters Adrian had spent with the miniature against his ribs were gone from his life also, and though he had at last laid the miniature down, he had not recovered the 9 winters, and he knew that he never would. Some winters do not thaw twice. Elias Corbin was in his lonely grave at Bristol, and no restitution had reached the wife he had abandoned to reach it, and no restitution ever would. There is a plain truth that must be spoken aloud once in every honest history, and it is this: happiness, when it comes late, does not undo what came before it. It only makes what came before it bearable to remember, and that is not the same thing. And only a foolish person mistakes the one for the other, and Honora Vale, who was not a foolish person, did not mistake it, and Adrian Vale, who had been slower to learn but had learnt it well, did not mistake it either, and their marriage was the stronger for being built upon the acknowledgement. Upon the anniversary of their meeting at the Blue Hart, which fell in October, they observed, without ever having agreed to observe it, a small private ritual which no one else in the household understood, though Mrs. Ivory, who understood most things, understood this also. And the ritual was this. Honora, in the morning, walked out to the orchard at Ledgerhope and picked up one late apple from the ground and turned it in her hand and put it in her apron and brought it into the house and set it upon the mantel of the small parlor beneath the brass candlestick. And Adrian, in the afternoon, coming in from the estate, took up the apple from the mantel without remark and cut it in half with his own pocket-knife and gave half to her, and ate the other half himself, standing by the fire, and the 2 of them ate their halves in silence, and did not speak of the letter that had once lain upon a mantel in another parlor under another brass candlestick, and did not need to, for the eating of the apple was the letter answered at last, and the answering had been a marriage and 2 children and a labor and a house, and neither of them regretted the answer, and neither of them forgot the letter, and this is the shape that a durable love takes when it is built upon an honest reckoning. It does not deny what it has cost. It eats the apple, and it lights the fire, and it goes on. There is a saying they used with one another in their later years, coined between them upon that first ritual evening and never written down, which was that a life mended in daylight is not the same as a life that was never broken, and that only the mended know the difference, and that the knowledge is the price of the mending, and worth the price. Say what you will of luck and rank, character is what shows in a room when the fire has burnt low and the ledger is closed, and there is no one left to see. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.